Right, welcome back guys, and this is officially week 8, and we'll just be spending the rest of this week adding a few more layers to our EMP shockwave and then finalizing all of that in comp. So we're just sort of picking and choosing. It's a little bit different, this effect, in that we're using a lot of the techniques we've used for some of the other effects and kind of trying to bring it together and do something different as well. So along with that comes also a slightly different workflow. I'm basically building up as much as possible as I can here in Houdini before comping. But just to mention quickly about that, if you guys are doing test renders in between or as you go and rendering out these layers, that's fine as well. Just to mention, I've had a few bad times where I would submit a render for overnight and I've forgotten to exclude or include an object. So just be sure to double check your renders and actually render out a few frames here in the render viewport, just to make sure that everything logically makes sense what you want from that pass. So it should be pretty straightforward in this sense, because what I've done up until now is basically every single layer that I want has its own mantra. So basically everything's matted out, and it's just about choosing what light that particular pass needs and making sure the environment has a light that matches up with the effect. So just double check that as you go if you are rendering. For now, before we get started on the more magical element I have planned for the middle, I think we should go and see if we can add a bit more detail to our shockwave. So just to mention about that, because I'm about to use some noises and stuff, I want to use the rest position. In one of the other videos, or I'm not sure if I recorded it or not, we had a subdivide somewhere here in our sphere, in our shockwave network, and I've moved that into the actual shockwave proxy right at the start. Just so that we have the final resolution geometry before our rest position here. So that should give us accurate rest to use as we update the shockwave shader. So first thing we need to do really is just get a render going of our spheres, and then let's see what we can do. So I want EMP shockwave. Let's just adjust some settings here because we're just testing. So I'm going to take off motion blur. Maybe just drop down the resolution a bit. Go half res maybe. So stuff like this, you really want to check you're changing all your settings back and you're happy with the final render quality. Okay, so I mean, the only thing we can really do here is, like I said, add some noise. But there is some extra stuff that I want, and for one, we have that mask in the point color that tells us that the sphere is close or colliding with the environment. So for starters, we need to get some kind of render pass out for that. So let's bind in color. We could try and do a few extra things with this particular attribute. So let's see how that goes for us. Firstly, let's have a look at it. Okay, so that actually looks pretty good. And remember, this is the smoothed one. If I come back to the object here, what I'm rendering is the spheres with the color that's been smoothed. So a little bit slow in SOPs to do that, but I mean, in the render, we're just getting a nice smooth fall off over here. So if I check the range there, we've got some decent ability to try and change that range there. So we can do something that I usually actually just do in comp and see if we can get a nice mask we could maybe use even with the noise. So let's do a multiply constant and drop this right down. Okay, so we're trying to kind of get down to the minimum sort of range we have on here, because then I should be able to use an exponent or power and get something really soft. So let me just compare that. Yeah, so I thought that was soft, but actually it's quite contrasty compared to knocking it right back and going below 1 on the exponent. So we get a nice soft fall off, which will give us even more room to kind of multiply a noise by this value. And then we can still bring back the brightness of the actual contact point. So if I just, well, I can duplicate these. Let's just put this back to 1 and go high. So say something really bright and closer to the ground there, and just add these together. So now we've got a soft fall off, plus it's quite bright down towards the ground, and that's just manipulating with multipliers and powers, manipulating this color attribute. So that's pretty cool. So we have something like that. Let's export this. I'm going to do a vector to vector 4, and I'm actually going to just put a constant in here, and instead of 0 I'll put a 1. It could be this pass we actually want to use the solid alpha for something, depending on how our render comes out. Oops, wrong one. So bind export. So that can be our mask, either now in the shader, or we make sure that's part of the EXR render as well. So we'll get that as a pass for comp. Alright, so let's try something with a noise here. Back to my favorite. I could use unified, or, well, you know what, I'm going to use unified because I want to just mess around with the lattice warp as well. Obviously you could just use a Worley noise, and instead of relying on lattice warp, you basically just plug in another noise and add it to the position of rest, which I think we've done before in another effect as well. So basically we call in rest, and this is to ensure that the spheres aren't growing through a noise in world space, but instead the noise is attached to the moving sphere. And so what I was talking about was here, if we used just a Worley noise without using the unified noise, we could just add a turbulent noise to this position first before plugging it into our Worley noise, and we'd get the same effect basically as using this lattice warp. But just for speed, I'm going to jump in with this. And the thing is about adding detail to the surface of the sphere is we don't really need to go crazy with it. I'm a bit worried about getting into the comp and there's just too much going on. So there's no point in sort of over complicating or adding too much detail here, because if we zoom out, and we'll do this in the comp as well, we still need to be able to see through that that layer of detail into the stuff we actually want to look at inside the spheres. So we don't want to overcomplicate that, but we do want something. We don't just want a sort of completely transparent reflective surface. So the thing is, I try and get used to using other noises, but I just really like a Wall-E. So this is kind of the fun part. You just play around and see, and a million things can come up, and you should totally experiment and play in a shader for just spend a whole day and play in the shader. You'll be amazed at the things you can come up with. I don't want this to take up too much time because, as I said, this effect shouldn't dominate compared to everything else. But it's really fun just to see how detailed you can make things in here. So this is kind of standard Wall-E with some fractal. Don't want to go too detailed with that. And I also usually, save quite a few of these renders and then compare and try and choose what's best. So like here, I've got some basic settings. I'll just save that. Try something. Looks pretty cool. So I just want something that feels like what we've been talking about the whole time, and it's kind of, it's an electrical field, it's a shock wave, it's not too detailed, but it feels like it's energetic or made out of some kind of energy. So so something like this feels pretty good. I'm just thinking about other options here. Let's leave it like that, because what I also want to try with this noise is just see how we can affect it with the color mask we've got here. So we have that. I'm going to take another power here and go even higher. So we'll just add that to the noise to make sure that we actually have a brighter area to the noise at any contact point. And so obviously here we're just seeing that kind of thing at the ground level, but it's happening wherever the sphere interacts with a tree or a wall or a car. So it'll be very interesting to see that moving. Talking about moving, let's add a subtle. Don't forget, if you're adding a $F kind of motion, either you should be using time or frame here. Otherwise, you need to promote the parameter to get a time-based element to work. So that's the wrong one. What am I doing? So let's just put something in here. I'll need to test this out as usual and render a few frames to see if this is too fast or too slow. Okay, what else can we do? So let's multiply the whole thing by the super soft one. So we have, let's try it. We'll take this result and multiply it by this one so that we don't have such a uniform noise. Oh, it's kind of cool. It's starting to look more and more like the moon. So I don't know if that's a good thing or not. I feel like this is just a little bit too much. So if you're getting slightly, let me make this bigger because I'm starting to get a little bit lost here. So this, we should name these for sure. That's our soft power, that's our medium one, and this is our super contrasty one. So I'm taking that contrasty one and adding it to the noise. So I'm just dropping that down a little bit. Doesn't need to be so extreme. And then I'm multiplying all of that by our very soft one. And yeah, I think that looks pretty cool. The nice thing about multiplying all of it by that is that this noise will also now be dependent on what it's traveling over and what it's interacting with. And then I do want to plug this into the emission, and we'll get that as an emission pass as well, if I can find it. But honestly, I could spend ages just messing around with interesting things to do in the shader. So this is a kind of cool marble effect here because we're seeing the reflection and that emissive surface. I'm just going to take this float and do a float to vector and a vector back to float. Oh, what am I doing? No. I've got this all wrong. Yeah, I want the vector because I want a color. But over here, I can multiply each one of these to get the color I want. So I want a blue, so I'll just knock the red down and knock the green down a bit. That's a nice neat little shader there. And there's our emission pass. So plenty of information here just to add something to our sphere's surface. Obviously we have our reflection passes which we'll want from that render as well. And then we have our mask as well. So I think we have everything we could want from this particular layer. So let's end this one here. Pretty happy with that. And I obviously duplicated a mantra that already had a mask AOV, one of my other ones. So just double check you have that, otherwise you need to add that as an extra image plane. So let's end this one here, and I'll see you back in the next video.